So up to this point, we've talked about how proteins are made during the topic of translation, and we've talked about the genomic perspective on gene discovery, and we'll be able to tie those together a little bit here in the topic of mutation. So mutation, the topic is not only about how mutations come about, but also the effects they have on the organism based on what we know about genes. So starting off with a little example here, this is an example from a human gene called OCA2, and OCA2 has been implicated in pigmentation. So the long name for that is oculocutaneous albinism. So albinism for albino, related to differences in pigment among individuals. And there's a lot of variation. So if you look across the human species, you'll see different versions of how OCA2 sequence is put together. And some of those differences matter to something about the phenotype, but some of those might not matter at all. We don't notice any differences. And the differences in the DNA sequence for the OCA2 gene, those are the result of mutations over time. So mutations, as we'll see, are changes to the DNA sequence, and they become interesting as we look at how those differences in DNA become differences in phenotype. So here's an example that gets us back to the topic of SNPs. So those, remember, were single nucleotide polymorphisms, a single nucleotide change in one one individual relative to the other. So two people might have a difference in one nucleotide in their OCA2 gene, and that would amount to a SNP. So a SNP is commonly found sort of as across the diversity of the human species. It's known that a lot of people have this difference. And so here are a couple of differences that have been shown to have an effect on the production of pigment in the individuals that have the difference. So this RS notation down here, this is the SNP code. These are unique codes. You can look these up in a database and learn about these SNPs. And these are two that are in the coding region of the OCA2 gene. So they are contained in the DNA that becomes part of the RNA, which is the code for the OCA2 protein. And that's a little OCA2 protein shown up here. Not too important that you know what that is, but maybe you like to see what a protein structure looks like. So one of those causes a change in amino acid at position number 305. So the 305th amino acid, depending on which SNP a person has, they can have arginine at that location, the R amino acid, or tryptophan at that position, the W amino acid. So these are the genotypes of some people that were surveyed in this study. And these people can be homozygous for the version that produces arginine, heterozygous, or homozygous for the version that produces tryptophan. And there's another SNP at a different location, position 419, that can produce either arginine for R or glutamine, abbreviated with Q. And the images here show the proportion of blue-eyed individuals, brown-eyed individuals, and green-eyed individuals in their study sample. So you can kind of track the genotypes and then follow those and see if they have a pattern that goes along with the eye color. Maybe one of the more interesting patterns here is that there are no blue-eyed individuals in the QQ genotype, the glutamine genotype, although I went ahead and put these down here at the bottom. This is the sample size, and there were hardly any individuals with that genotype. So you have to take this a little bit with a grain of salt. That it's not an equal set of individuals. There might be individuals that have blue eyes with this genotype and they weren't discovered in the study. But still, they found basically a significant correlation between these genotypes and eye color for the people in the study. So that would be, you'd hypothesize that the phenotype, the difference in eye color, would come down to a difference in how this protein is put together, and that in turn is caused by a difference in the nucleotide sequence. That would be due to these one or both of these SNP mutations. So you can look at, even more broadly across the human population. These are some SNPs that also affect OCA2 They're not necessarily associated with eye color. They could be associated with skin pigmentation. But this, I kind of like this study. It's got a geographic map of human populations, I believe probably skewed towards people whose ancestors were in those places. So people in Europe with European ancestry, people in northeastern Eurasia with ancestry there, people in Eastern and Southeastern Asia with ancestry there. And these are genetic forms that track with those populations. So mutations resulting in genetic differences, and these are also amino acid changes. So alanine to threonine, arginine to glutamine. This is the one we saw before. Histidine to arginine. And what this shows is that people in different parts of the world can have features, phenotypes that are sort of characteristic of their population because they have an ancestor in the past that developed that difference relative to the rest of the human population worldwide. So not to say necessarily that any of this is adaptive. I think we sometimes tend to think that changes have to be, positive, good things for the individuals that have them. These could just be sort of haphazard, happenstance mutations that happen to be present in these populations because those populations already were genetically descended from a few individuals. Um, Nonetheless, though, there's a little bit of a correlation in blue eye color and lighter skin tones with people who live farther away from the equator. So farther away from the equator, they get less sun exposure over the year, and having decreased pigmentation can improve the production of vitamin D, which requires sunlight. So a little bit possibly positive correlation of an adaptive reason, or just a kind of a quirk of ancestry here. And I guess while I'm on this topic, a lot of people are interested in eye color. This is a topic you can find internet sources for lots of information about why people have blue eyes, brown eyes, green eyes, anything in between. And I just want to throw out there the idea that there's not a simple cause for eye color. It's not simple enough to say, I know you have blue eyes and therefore you have this version of DNA. We've already seen on the previous slide here and the one before that, lots of evidence that there are multiple changes that could individually cause differences in eye color, skin color, etc. So it ties in pretty well with the mutation topic, and also something that we cover as we get more complex in genetics, that a lot of phenotypes such as skin color, eye color, they're not caused by just one gene. But you could find if they're genetic, if they're heritable, you could track back to the cause for those changes. So here's kind of an illustration of one of the ways that this brown eye versus blue eye phenotype could develop. The brown eye phenotype is the ancestral phenotype for the human population. So the first humans had brown eyes. Lots of people today still have brown eyes, and they've retained that difference, or that phenotype from the ancestors. So the ancestral version of the OCA2 gene was functional. Functional gene produces a functional RNA, and then that RNA is able to produce the ancestral version of OCA2 protein, which goes ahead and makes pigment for the eyes and other parts of the body. And the blue eyes phenotype would be resulting from, say, a different version of the OCA2 gene. So with one of these differences that we talked about, that through the process of transcription produces RNA that's got whatever the difference is in the coding region, and then translation of that RNA gives you the derived protein. So basically, one version of blue eyes versus brown eyes is that the one version of the protein produces the brown eye pigment, and one version of the protein does not produce the brown eye pigment. So it's maybe deficient in that ability to make pigment in a way that's not, maybe not maladaptive, but just a difference in the appearance of these individuals.